Okay, I think we're going. Thank you again for joining us. Appreciate very much you taking the time to do so. We are constantly making some changes in our procedure and our approach here. We have a new camera and we have a new system here to broadcast, and so I appreciate Joel's help with all of that, and hopefully I can follow his instructions and get online, and I trust that we're broadcasting. I might just mention this. We do have a few new gadgets, but we still got the same computer, and my computer doesn't have a battery. And right now there's a thunderstorm that's around the area, so I mentioned this in the unlikely event that something would happen. If the lights go out, this is going down, and so if I don't get a chance to say see you next week, I just wanted you to know what was going on. But anyway, I trust that won't happen. Glad you're here, and I appreciate very much your interest in this study. We are studying from the Proverbs. Um, I began this rather concentrated study of the Proverbs some time back because I felt I needed it, and I thought that this would be a worthy study to share with others. I think all the Bible is practical. I think all of it is needed. It's the gift of God, but certainly wisdom in our age is as much needed now as it ever has been. There is no abundance of it in our society, I'm sorry to say. There are a lot of smart people, but wise people, that's a different category. And so we'd like to add to the number of the wise. We'd like to correct problems in our own lives. So I commend the Proverbs to you. Our efforts are trying to understand the words, how the Holy Spirit put them together, and what the practical lessons are from this book. We may or may not be successful at that, but the Proverbs are there to bless us. So I always commend this, and I commend this to our young people, and I commend this to our parents, our good parents. If you're looking for a way to spend some quality time with your children, read the Proverbs together and discuss them, talk about them, think about them. If there are passages you run across you're not sure of, then you investigate and find out together. And look for ways to apply these great principles. They are needed by parents and by young people. So I hope that that's something that you'll keep in mind. I believe the world would be a better place if the Proverbs were more widely known and appreciated. But we are in Proverbs 26, and it'll be our purpose tonight to begin where we left off last time. Proverbs 26, and let's see here. All right, Proverbs 26, and then verse 23. Burning lips and a wicked heart are like a potsherd covered with silver dross. He that hateth dissembleth with his lips, and layeth up deceit within him. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. Whose hatred is covered by deceit, his wickedness shall be showed before the whole congregation. There are several lessons in those 4 verses that speak to hypocrisy and the danger of hypocrisy, of those who would be seemingly our friends, and yet the whole time would truly be desirous to hurt, to destroy us. In the first place, we notice in verse 23 about the old King James says the burning lips, fervent, passionate, not in a sexual way, but more in the idea of great emotion, of great warmth, to say that, well, oh, you're my friend. All the words of kindness and affection and support that really are just masking hatred and bitterness. He compares it, these great images that the wise man brings to us of what looks like maybe a silver object, and yet it's just the silver dross, just the waste material when you purify silver, a thin layer of that covering over a clay pot. there's not really any value there. It looks a lot better than it really is. The ISV reads, a clay vessel platted with a thin veneer of silver. That's what smooth lips and a wicked heart are. It's just sort of the glazing, as one fellow compared it with. But really there's something else underneath. Mr. Stewart said the pretensions of friendship where real malice are harbored, utterly worthless, and of course that's right. And I think we like to take people at face value, and I don't believe that the scriptures um, call us to paranoia, but I think there's always a wisdom, there's always a carefulness involved. Um, we give people a chance to prove themselves, but we're also not so blind as not to read and be able to see the signs and to understand that there are real dangers there, that not everybody is what they claim to be. In verse 24, we are reminded of the fact that many times hatred and deceit go together. He that hateth dissembleth with his lips. Dissemble is an old word that suggests the idea of deceit, of disguise. Hypocrisy is sometimes a synonym in the New Testament for dissembling. So again, here's a person who hates, and yet his speech points in the other direction. There's deceit within him. I guess sometimes people are open in their hatred and bold about it. But in so many cases, one of the modern speech translation reads, who is filled with hate disguises it with his speech, but inside he holds on to deceit. Here's a man who really has a different motive than what he appears to have. He may never be critical to us, at least to our face, but he's working something else. We've got to be aware that there are people who are not what they claim to be. Again, he's not encouraging paranoia, but he is recognizing the fact that a part of wisdom is realizing there are wolves sometimes in sheep's clothing. Not every sheep is a wolf, but there are people who are impure in their motives, and who are users, and who are hateful, and who are malicious. Don't be naive about that. Wisdom demands that we be discerning and we be thoughtful along that line. In verse 25, we find another aspect of this lesson. When he speaks fair, believe him not, for there are 7 abominations in his heart. When he talks charmingly, do not trust him, because 7 disgusting things are in his heart. A fellow like that will show himself, and if we're wise, we'll be alert to those things. I cannot help but think about some Old Testament examples, some Bible examples along this line. And if you're a student of the Old Testament, when you read about people who smile and then stab you in the back, don't you think about Joab? Joab was a general in the army of David. He was also a kinsman of David. All those folks seem to be kinfolks. And we read a story in the 20th chapter of 2 Samuel about Joab and another general by the name of Amasa. Amasa was a man who had made some bad choices in life, and he made another bad one, last fatal bad decision, and that is that he was too trusting of Joab. I don't want to get into the whole story or bog down this lesson with the whole story. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to go back and read it. But you remember how that David faced a rebellion from Absalom, and how that Amasa, who was a kinsman likewise of David, had gone to the other side. But David had tried to make peace, and he had extended the olive branch to Amasa to come and work for him. Now, right on the heels of just quenching this great threat from Absalom, another threat arises from a fellow by the name of Sheba, who was of the tribe of Benjamin, That was King Saul's tribe, and there were still some hard feelings apparently. And so Sheba was going to go up north and try to gather a group against David. And so David calls on Amasa, you got to gather the troops together. And of course he has a hard time doing that within the allotted time. And so David, now in desperation, calls on Joab. He really has in mind replacing Joab with Amasa. But Amasa is not able to get the job done in time, so he calls on Joab to help. And so both of them now are out on the job. And there's a meeting between these two men. In verse 8, let's just pick up the story in chapter 20, 2 Samuel 20. When they were at the great stone which is in Gibeah, Amasa went before them, and Joab's garment that he had on, that he had put on, was girded with him, and upon it the girdle of the belt, his sword, fastened thereon his loins, in the sheath thereof. And he went forth, and it fell out. So here they run into each other. And we find Joab approaching now Amasa, a man that he's had conflict with, a man who is, in David's mind, his replacement, a fellow for whom he has not any use, but he meets him with a broad smile. Now, what seems like incidentally, but I think was a lot more than that as we read the story. Of course, he's girded with a sword, and if he had come at Amasa with the sword in his right hand, Amasa might have been put on guard. But it seems as if he just dropped it. And so he picks it up, this text says, with his left hand. And so he's approaching with a broad smile. He does have a weapon in his hand, but we saw what happened. We don't think of this as being any threat. I'm sure Amasa was thinking, now what should I say to him? How am I going to make peace with him? We're going to have to work together now, and we need to make this right. All these things are going through Amasa's mind. Joab said to Amasa, verse 9, art thou in health, my brother? And Joab took Amasa by the beard with his right hand to kiss him. I don't think that's a threatening move in and of itself any more than we might think of maybe hugging somebody by grabbing their shoulder or the back of their neck. It wasn't intended to, it didn't look like Amasa to be a judo move or something. It was more a friendly, intimate gesture. Amasa didn't think much about that sword. Verse 10 says, he took no heed to the sword that was in Joab's hand. He didn't think about it until he realized that Joab had stuck it through his ribs. He smote him therewith in the fifth rib, and shed his bowels to the ground, and struck him not again. One blow. That's all it took, and it was a devastating blow. And he died. So Joab and Abishai, his brother, pursued after Sheba, the son of Bichri. And one of Joab's men stood by him and said, he that favoreth Joab and is for David, let him go after Joab. And Amasa, verse 12, wallowed in blood in the midst of the highway. When the man saw that all the people stood still, he removed Amasa out of the highway into the field and cast a cloth over him. Because they're trying to gather an army together to go north, and nobody can get past the sight of Amasa there in that devastating picture. He had to remove him and cover him over so that people might be able to pass by and get their mind on something else. Amasa made a big mistake. Amasa failed to appreciate the danger from a guy like Joab. He took Joab too literally. He didn't realize that there was a silver dross over something that was very different. Just a veneer of friendliness over somebody who had murderous intentions in this case. He should have known better, because there was an earlier incident, in the life of Joab, and he's an interesting character. Not all bad. He certainly was a man who was, I'll say, if not wise, shrewd, a man of courage, a man of skill, no doubt, a man who helped David out in some cases. But it was several years earlier. If you go back to the book of 2 Samuel 3 is what I'm trying to say. 2 Samuel chapter 3. That a similar incident took place. This time, again, David was at war with the house of Saul. After Saul died for several years, the Benjamites and several in Israel followed after the the son of one of the sons of Saul, a guy named Ishbosheth. And the fellow who really was the power behind the throne was a powerful general named Abner. Abner was no cartoon character. He was a strong, powerful man and a real threat to those who followed David. But he became disenchanted, reasons we won't get into, with his boss, and he sent a message to David and said, if you want me to come and serve you, I'll do it. If you want me to bring Israel with me, I can do that too. So they met together. And we read about that story in 2 Samuel chapter 3. Verse 20, Abner came to David to Hebron, and 20 men with him. And David made Abner and the men that were with him a feast. And Abner said, I'm satisfied. I'm going to go back home, and I'm going to bring those folks back to you, and I'll bring Israel back to you. And David was very pleased with that and sent him away in peace. Now, who wasn't present was David's general, Joab. Joab knew Abner very well. Abner had, against his own desires, actually killed Joab's brother in battle. So there was a blood feud there, and Joab stomped around when he found out what had happened. He told David he was being a fool, that Abner was just coming over here to spy him out. You can't trust him, and so on. And without David's knowledge, he chased after Abner. But he lured him into a deception. Verse 23 of 2 Samuel 3 tells us that Joab, with all the host that was with him, they told Joab that Abner had been there. And so Joab came. Let me see, verse 26 is what I'm looking for, I'm sorry. When Joab was come out from David, he sent messengers after Abner, which brought him again from the well of Sirah. David didn't know it. When Abner was returned to Hebron, Joab took him aside in the gate to speak with him quietly. And I'm sure Abner was thinking, how am I going to make this right with him? I've got to make peace with this guy. We're going to have to work together. Sounds familiar. But instead, it was a blade under the fifth rib, and he died. He died because of the blood that he had shed, the blood of Joab's brother. And afterward, verse 28, when David heard it, he said, I and my kingdom are guiltless before the Lord forever from the blood of Abner the son of Ner. Let it rest upon the head of Joab. And I bring that story up to say that certainly Amasa had reason to be suspicious of a guy like Joab. It's not like he hasn't done this before. And so the wisdom of the Lord is you need to recognize that everybody can't be taken at face value. There are other motives involved. You need to be discerning and prudent. There needs to be a proving ground so that you might see and understand where people are coming from. Be aware of the dangers involved. Later on, of course, when David's life comes to an end and he is speaking with Solomon about his reign and his coming reign, he warns him about this man Joab, and he says, you remember the innocent blood that he shed and the guile he used to defeat men of war in assassinations, really. He said, be aware of this man, watch him, don't let his gray head go to the grave in peace. And of course, again, Joab showed himself even in Solomon's reign, and it was Solomon's job to bring justice finally to him. Others, I think, have done better than Amasa and Abner. In Ezra chapter 4, there's a story there. This has to do years later with the return from the captivity. When the Israelites came back to the land of promise, they had been taken away because of their sin. They had spent years in Babylonian captivity. Now they're coming back, and they're going to rebuild the temple and rebuild the wall and reestablish the work of God in this land that God promised Abraham so many years before. Now Ezra chapter 4 tells us about this. the fellow who was leading Israel at this time was a governor. They didn't have a king, but a governor by the name of Zerubbabel. And so chapter 4 of Ezra and verse 1 begins that when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the children of the captivity builded the temple unto the Lord God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the chief of the fathers, and they said to them, Let us build with you, for we seek your God as ye do, and we do sacrifice unto him since the days of Esarhaddon. Well, that wasn't true. We know from the inspired history. Now that the people who are speaking here were a part of a group that became known as the Samaritans. They came from the rabble of the land, frankly, that was left along with these foreigners that were brought in to settle the land. They had been involved in idolatry from the start. They had never been faithful to the law of Moses. The text even calls them adversaries, but they come as if they are just wanting to help. But Zerubbabel is not fooled by that. And he says very sharply to them in verse 3, Ye have nothing to do with us building a house unto the Lord our God. In verse 4, Then, when they rebuffed, the people of the land weakened the hands of the people of Judah and troubled them in building. We see now how deep that commitment was. We just serve the Lord. We've always done that. Not really. You got to be careful. That's what the wise man is calling on us to do. Be aware. Be careful. Back in our text now. One more point along this line in verse 26. He talks about one whose hatred is covered by deceit. His wickedness shall be showed before the whole congregation. Or as one translation puts it, his hatred is deceitfully hidden, but his wickedness will be revealed to the community. There's a time, like we just read, when you'll find out what people really believe. They may say this and they may say that, but under the right light, you'll find out exactly what they are and who they are. You've heard this point made before, but sometimes it takes trouble before you find out who your real friends are. And it takes trouble sometimes for me to see myself if I'm really a friend or if it's just all talk. There's a time when that difference will come to light. And the wise man reminds us that's a part of discernment, recognizing that to be true. Okay, let me move on then to verse 27. In 26:27 we read, Whoso diggeth a pit shall fall therein, and he that rolleth a stone, it will be returned upon him. What does he have in mind here? I think when he talks about the pit and the stone, he seems to be talking about traps or weapons. That's at least the idea that most have, and it seems to fit well there. The idea of a pit is the picture of some sort of a trap, again, set for someone. Rolling a stone, you can read in the Old Testament about stones used as weapons. The idea of rolling a stone on a precipice and rolling it down on a certain individual, an army that's attacking, or whatever it might be. And what this passage says is that for those who seek to do another harm, for those who hold a malicious spirit toward another, Providence has a way of bringing that back on them. We can read principles about this kind of justice. Proverbs chapter 12, we noticed a passage like this. Well, several actually, but here's one we'll read. The wicked is snared by the transgression of his lips. Here's a man whose wicked behavior has a way of coming back and trapping him. I don't know that I included this, but I remember that there's an Old Testament story. We were talking about David earlier. You know, David had that long struggle with Saul. And then when King Saul was killed, not by David's hand, but in battle with the Philistines, the text tells us that Saul killed himself and died there with his sons on Mount Gilboa. Well, the fellow who brought word of Saul's death, in fact, brought the evidence of Saul's death. was an Amalekite. It's an interesting story in 2 Samuel chapter 1. Apparently, a young opportunist came along Mount Gilboa, and he found the body of Saul. And so he made up a story. He thought, well, if I will bring back evidence of Saul's death, this will be, in effect, handing the kingdom to David, and he'll reward me. So this young Amalekite makes up a story about how that he happened to be going by about the time that Saul was mortally wounded, and Saul asked him, begged him, in fact, to just to kill me. And so he says, that's what I did. I killed him, finished him off, and brought back this evidence, and just wanted you to know. So I'm the one to bring you this good news. And of course, he just totally misunderstood the situation. David would follow Saul as king, but David loved Saul, despite all that Saul had done for him. That was the man that David had devoted himself to as a young man. Had known and worked with Saul for years. And David was infuriated. He said, who are you? He said, well, I'm an Amalekite, a stranger. He said, and you weren't afraid to raise your hand to the Lord's anointed? You know, David could have killed Saul if he had wanted to, but he wouldn't dare do that. And now you presume to do this? At least he claimed to. So David said to him, this is in 2 Samuel 1, he said, thy blood be upon thy head. For thy mouth hath testified against thee, saying, I have slain the Lord's anointed. David rewarded him by having him killed. And so it is that people find that they are called on to pay for their crimes, that their traps set for others, their wicked schemes wind up backfiring on them. There's a similar passage over in Ecclesiastes chapter 10, where the wise man writes there, he who makes a hole for others will himself go into it, and for him who makes a hole through a wall, the bite of a snake will punish him. The imagery seems to be of somebody who, again, is trying to lay a trap or who's trying to break through some lawful barrier. And the point made there is that has a way of backfiring. He's talking here about the providence of God, the justice of God. And we can certainly find examples in the Scriptures and examples through the years of occasions when that took place. Maybe the most famous is found over in the book of Esther, the 7th chapter. One of the key stories in this great book has to do with a man named Haman. He served the king of Persia, and Haman became angered at the behavior of one of the Jews, a man by the name of Mordecai. He wouldn't bow to him and scrape to him as others did. Haman had been appointed to a position much higher than he should have been. And so his pride and his fury became so great, he thought it too small a thing just to somehow dispatch Mordecai. He was going to slaughter all the Jews throughout the empire. And he got the king to agree to it without really realizing all the circumstances. One of the things that the king didn't know and that Haman didn't know was the king's beloved queen was Esther, who was a Jewess and actually related to Mordecai. You know the story. So anyway, Mordecai thinks he is so smart. He's laid this plan out to destroy the Jews, and as the story goes on, he's decided that before all the Jews die, he's going to fix this one Jew first, Mordecai. And he had gallows constructed, gallows upon which he would hang Mordecai and take great satisfaction in that. Well, as his plan falls apart, and as God uses Esther to speak to the king, and the king begins to realize how he's been manipulated by this servant who, as far as he knows, is trying to kill his queen. Of course, things rapidly deteriorate, and Haman now is condemned to death. And it's in the 7th chapter of Esther that one of the chamberlains of the king says, you want to get rid of Haman? He's built gallows for Mordecai. The king said, that's fine. Use the gallows and hang Haman on his own gallows. And of course, we still use that expression. They hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai, verse 19. That happens sometimes. We've mentioned David several times already tonight. Several of the Psalms, of course, were written by David. We know they are attributed to David directly. Maybe some of the others that are not attributed likewise are David's work. But in the 57th Psalm, this is a psalm attributed to David when he was running from Saul, when he was in a very bad circumstance. And, you know, Saul's own insane jealousy was at the root of the problem. But you know there were also men around King Saul egging that on. They knew what the king wanted to hear, and so they would be around Saul, pouring poison in his ear, pouring gas on the fire, as it were, talking David down, attributing all kind of wild motives and hateful things to David. And so in this psalm, in Psalm 57, here are men who have dug a pit for David. And he writes about them. He says, "They have prepared a net for my steps. My soul is bowed down. They have digged a pit before me. Into the midst thereof they are fallen themselves." What David said was that God in his providence was going to wind up destroying those who were seeking to destroy his innocent life. Just one more of a number of examples we could give of this principle is found over in the book of Daniel. Well, again, a lot of great stories in the book of Daniel, but one of them that we've heard and taught our children and enjoy reading is the story of Daniel in the lion's den. You remember the backstory there. Again, Daniel is an Israelite taken in captivity. He's serving in a Persian court. Well, he served first in the Babylonian court. And it's under this Babylonian king, Nebuchadnezzar, that he first begins to encounter trials and tribulations. But it's under Darius and under the Persians that our story takes place. In Daniel chapter 6, Darius has been flattered and manipulated by his courtiers who are jealous of Daniel. And they say, you know, Daniel is such a man of integrity, but I'll tell you how we can fix him. Something to do with his devotion to his God. So they convince Darius that he ought to make a precept throughout the land that nobody for 30 days can pray to any higher source than himself. Only to Darius can people appeal. No one can pray to any god, just to Darius. Well, so he gives this ridiculous order. And of course Daniel's not going to stop praying to God. As these kings of that age often did, it was some awful, terrible, over-the-top kind of punishment. The punishment is whoever violated this law will be thrown into the lion's den. Now Daniel is a favorite of the king, but obviously the king didn't know him very well if he thought that Daniel quit praying. But anyway, the king is furious about this. He doesn't like this, and he realizes these men have used him and his power to try to get at Daniel. So the story goes that he looks for some way to find an out. There is no out, and he has to put Daniel in this den of hungry lions and lock him up there for a night. And he spends a sleepless night just hoping somehow that the God of Daniel can preserve him. Well, of course he does. And later on in this 6th chapter, when the cry goes out from the king, "O Daniel, servant of the living God, is thy God, whom thou servest continually, able to deliver thee from the lions." Verse 21 now of Daniel 6. "Then said Daniel unto the king, O king, live forever. My God hath sent his angel, and hath shut the lions' mouths. For they have not hurt me, for as much as before him innocency was found in me. And also before thee, O king, I have done no hurt." And the king was exceedingly glad, and commanded that they should take Daniel out of the den. And so Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no manner of hurt was found upon him, because he believed in his God. But then, verse 24, remember that part about the fellow who digs a pit will fall in it? "Then the king commanded that they bring those men that had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions with them, the children and the wives, their whole families. And the lions had the mastery of them. and break all their bones in pieces ever they came to the bottom of the den. A very grisly story there. But it's an example of this principle, that people who plot and plan the downfall of the righteous find themselves in the throes of their own wickedness or their own circumstances. Now, let me hasten to add something that you already know to be true. I don't think the Scriptures promises that that's always absolute in this life. But I'd say this, it is absolute. There are a number of great passages, inspired writings. The 73rd Psalm is a great example, and we'll not take time tonight to go back and to look at that in depth. But it's a psalm that deals with the question, you know, what happens when you look around and it seems like wicked people are prospering? And of course, the inspired writer makes the point. He said, I felt my feet slipping. I felt myself slipping when I saw the prosperity of the wicked, and then I remembered their end. There is an end of the wicked, and I think that even if in this life people live and die in rebellion against God, and yet at the same time in seeming comfort, there's a very sobering promise made in passages like Revelation chapter 20. Near to the last thing that God tells us is that there will be a day when the devil that deceived them will be cast into the lake of fire and brimstone. And then in verse 15, verse 11 says there will be a day in which all the dead, verse 12, small and great, will stand before God, and the books will be opened, and the book of life, and they'll be judged out of those things written in the books according to their works. And verse 15 says, whosoever was not found written in the book of life will be cast into the lake of fire. Nothing could be more serious than that. It's a reminder to us of something, that God has a way of working in this life and bringing those who are haughty and proud and rebellious against Him low. But even in those cases where we don't see it in this life, there's no doubt that justice is absolute in the ultimate sense of the term. So, these Proverbs speak to us. Let me see here. Yes. Let me notice with you verse 28. Let's finish out the 26th chapter anyway. A lying tongue hates those that are afflicted by it, and a flattering mouth worketh ruin. A lying tongue hates those that are afflicted by it. What he does for us here is he draws a connection between mistreating people and our attitude toward them. That may seem rather basic, but I think there's something very important about that. The reason why I mistreat somebody is because I don't love them like I should. I may tell myself all kind of reasons why, but the reason why I treat others in an unkind way, in a dishonest way, is an unfair way, is because there's something lacking in my heart. Matthew Henry points out there are two kinds of lies that are equally detestable. He talks about a lying tongue and about a flattering mouth. There are two kinds of lying here. There's the slandering lie, which avowedly hates those spoken of. And there's the flattering lie, which is secretive. It appears to be one thing when it's something else. And oftentimes it goes unnoticed for a time. A wise man will be more afraid, he ends, of the flatterer that kisses and kills than of the slanderer who proclaims war. They're both dangerous. The flatterer may be more dangerous. And we've got to be, again, aware of the dangers posed there. Mr. Bridges wrote, we should be as much troubled by unjust praises as by unjust slanders. That's a great point. You know, people are unfair with us and accuse us falsely. We feel the sting of that. But if somebody comes up and praises us unjustly, we ought to likewise recognize the danger there. Maybe they're just overly kind, or maybe they're just silly. Or maybe they're trying to maneuver us, and they're trying somehow to manipulate us. Maybe there's guile being used. But either way, the point is that whether the lie comes from the direction of the slander or the flatterer, they're equally dangerous. Uh, and the point that the wise man begins with in this 28th verse is that the lying tongue hates those that are afflicted by it. The lying tongue, men hate those they injure, as one fellow put it. And that's right. I like what Mr. Garrett said. He said the liar despises not only the truth, but the victim as well. That's exactly right. If I'm going to spread slander, some kind of dirt on somebody that either I don't know if it's true or not, or I may know it's not true, but I just think he deserves it. Just another way for me to kick him. I not only hate that man, I hate the truth. And both those things are marks against me. I might tell myself in how many ways I'm justified in giving back as maybe I've been done. None of that matters. What my behavior, whether I am a flatterer or whether I am a slanderer, the one thing that comes back to me as I look at that mirror is I recognize how empty my heart is of what is good and right, what should be there. There's a great passage, and this is principle taught several times in the Bible and in the New Testament in particular. But over in Romans 13 and in verse 8, Paul calls on us to be honorable and to be those who are honest in our dealings. He said, "Owe no man anything. Pay your debts." But he adds this: there's one debt that you never can pay. Owe no man anything in terms of worldly, monetary circumstances. But he said, you always owe men this: love one another. For he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. What does he mean by that? Verse 9. For this, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness, thou shalt not covet. If there be any other commandment, it is briefly comprehended in this saying, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore love is the fulfilling of the law. All that the law of Moses pointed to, and those things incorporated in the law of Christ as well, the law we live under. But they all might be summarized in that simple statement: have charity in your hearts, love one another. If you love as you ought to, you're not going to think about stealing somebody else's wife, or even stealing his car, or stealing some other material object from him. You're not going to bear false witness against him. You're certainly not going to do him harm physically. If you love as you ought to love, it takes care of all these other things. And back in our text, the point made here is that if you have an evil tongue, and if you abuse other people with your speech, you hate them. You have to come to terms with the fact that you're ruled by hate, and that separates you from God. The Lord taught us that great lesson. Whatsoever you would that men should do unto you, do ye even so to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Same point. That you can, in essence, find yourself fulfilling so many of the commands of God the way you ought to, if your heart is filled with charity. And how impossible it is to fulfill what God would have us to do if we do not have that spirit within ourselves. So the Proverbs again speak to points that are very basic, but as we quoted Mr. Coolidge last week, if we just all do the things we know are right, if we just do the simple things, that would take care of so much of the rest of it. And I think the Lord would teach us the same lesson, in other words. Put to practice treating your neighbor as yourself and loving other people as God loves us. That's going to help with a lot of problems that I face and that I struggle with. I appreciate the kind way that you've listened and tuning in this week, and we look forward to being with you again soon. Thanks so much for being a part of this.